Welcome to the deepest corner of history that no one wants to remember, but also can't forget. If you think the world is too loud, too noisy, and too cruel, you might find it comforting to know it's always been that way. Before there were guns, before there were flags, before there was the word war, humans were killing each other. But the first war wasn't about courage. It wasn't about honor or strategy. The first war was about fear. And fear was the first language that all humans ever understood before they learned to speak. If you feel like this story needs to be shared with more people, please help me by hitting like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to this channel. Stories like this need space, time, and silence, and I want to keep reading them to you. Imagine a world that didn't know it was going to hate itself. No cities, no horses, no knives, only sharper stones than usual, and faster hands than your neighbors. Imagine you live in a small group, 20 to 30 people. Your family and those strong enough or gentle enough to be left behind. You have no names, no time. This year is not 12,000 BC. This year does not exist. Only today. Only your footsteps. Only your hunger. You wake when the birds nod and the darkness creeps in. You sleep when night falls like a hungry beast that embraces you. You live to hunt, to eat, to keep your children from being eaten by bears or starving because the rivers are dry. But one morning, the sky looks strange, the birds are silent, and from behind the bushes a pair of eyes appear, not those of an animal, but of another human. He carried a spear made of hardwood and a stone tip, forged by a hatred that had yet to be named. This is not fiction. This is not allegory. This is a reality that has been quietly buried beneath the sands and sediments of millennia. The first human being killed by another human was not out of love or revenge, but out of fear. Somewhere in North Africa, long before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before writing, there was a group of people living on the banks of the ancient Nile River. That day they went to fetch water, but when they returned, they did not know that it was the last day of their world. We know about them not because they wrote, but because they died in a way too brutal for the earth to remember. The Jebel Sahaba site, some 13,000 years old, contains the remains of 59 ancient humans, many with arrows still stuck in their ribs, broken fibulae, cracked skulls, the crushed hands of children. There are no fortresses, there are no barricades, just bodies sleeping in silence, and the earth that records the violence in its own layers. Someone once said that history is the voice of the dead, too loud to be ignored. And here, in Jebel Sahaba, the dead are screaming, not because they know they are at war, but because they do not know why they are being killed. They didn't know the word enemy. They didn't know what strategy was. They didn't sing before killing, didn't dance after winning. They just saw a strange face staring at them like an animal, and in that gaze, a possibility rose. If it's not him who dies, maybe I will. And like that, the history of war began. Before flags, before kingdoms, before horses stepped on the ground and carried banners of greatness, humans could already raise their hands and swing them at each other's faces. We don't know their names, but we know they were killed in formation. They weren't killed while hunting. They weren't trapped by wild animals. They were killed together, in one day, in one moment. And when one group of humans attacked another group collectively, that was the first war, even if the world didn't know how to spell it yet. After that day, the world was not the same. At night, groups began to set up guards. They began to hide children. They began to sleep with their eyes open. They began to fear each other, and fear, like a seed planted in blood, began to grow into a system. The First War was not a tale of heroes. It was not about honor, courage, or glory. It was just one cold morning where men realized, I can take what you have, if you die. And that was the beginning of civilization as we know it, built on fear too great to ignore, enhanced by violence too systematic to condemn, and passed down like a silent legacy embedded in our DNA. There are places in this world where history is not written in ink, but in blood that soaks into the sand. And the sand dries, petrifies, becomes time. Jebel Sahaba, a name they do not know, for they died thousands of years before humans learned to name places. Before Africa was a continent. Before Egypt was a kingdom. Before the word murder was a concept. Jebel Sahaba is not a village. It is not a city. It is not a battlefield. It is simply a place where people bury their loved ones with hearts that do not yet know how to grieve. Imagine you are someone from that time. The night before, you look up at a sky full of stars. There are no lights. There is no sound of engines, just the hum of insects and the beat of your heart. You sleep in the arms of your family. Your young child nurses at night. Your wife holds your hand. You live off the river that gave life, fish, water, and the shadow of the sky. But the next day, the sky changed. The air turned to stone. And you heard screams you had never heard before, screams that were not from wounds, but from shock. In 1965, archaeologists found them, 59 bodies buried in the ground, together, flat, still. Some still had sharp stone tips piercing their bones. Some were stuck in the ribs. Some had cracked skulls. Some had pierced their pelvises, as if they had been shot from behind while running. This was no coincidence. This was no animal attack. This was no accident. This was an organized attack. And among the bodies were children. There were mothers whose bodies were very close to the skeletons of their children. They were probably holding each other when the last arrow hit them. No survivors. But that's not what makes it terrifying. What's terrifying is this isn't a war they chose. This is the end of a world that hasn't even been named yet. Jebel Sahaba is silent evidence that humans can look at the face of another human being and choose to kill them. No declaration, no drums, no flags, no reason, except they are not us. One by one, the bodies were studied. One by one, the wounds were counted. Long before emotional wounds became a modern term, wounds on bones spoke more truthfully. Of the 59 skeletons, 24 had severe traumatic wounds. Some had more than one weapon wound. Some showed signs of healing, which meant they had been attacked before and lived long enough to do it again. It meant violence is not an incident, it is a pattern. They lived in a cycle of fear, waiting for the next attack, sleeping with one eye open, teaching their children to hide, not to make friends. One child, perhaps 7 years old, had an arrow wound to his lower jaw. Her bones were small, fragile. She probably didn't know why she had to die. A woman, probably pregnant. A splinter pierced her hip. She didn't get to give birth. She didn't get to give a name. She didn't get to know that she would be dug up thousands of years later by humans who were still fighting, but now with metal and machines. And maybe, the night after the attack, those who were still alive dug graves, with their hands, with stones, with trembling. They didn't cry because they probably didn't know what tears meant. They buried their brothers, one by one, silently, with soil, with prayers that didn't yet have a form. And somehow, the soil kept them, protecting them from time, until one day humans with brushes and pencils came and tried to understand what had happened. They didn't know they were making history. They didn't know that their wounds would be lessons. They knew only one thing, that after that day, they would never sleep again like they did before. Jebel Sahaba does not stand alone, but it is the oldest. The first witness that wars do not start because of hatred. They start because of scarcity, because of water, because of space, because of prejudice, and because of one thought, better them dead than me. When we look at satellite images of Jebel Sahaba today, we see only desert and ruins. But if you stand still long enough and close your eyes, you can hear that final scream, a scream made of fear too ancient to explain and too familiar to forget. Imagine a world without language. It's not that people didn't talk, but they didn't know how to name things that were too big, too terrible, too real. Like loss, like fear, like war. They didn't have words for it. But they knew what it felt like, and sometimes the body learns before the tongue. Today, we call it conflict. But back then, there were no words, just blank stares, just rocks smashed into foreheads, just spears thrust into the belly of someone you didn't know, because he looked hungry, and you only had one fish for your family. Before nations, before kingdoms, humans lived in small groups, traveling, hunting, gathering, sometimes settling for a while, building campfires, boiling tubers, drying meat. And in the distance, there was another group. They didn't come to attack, didn't talk, didn't laugh. They just see you from a distance. That's the seed. Violence doesn't grow from hatred, it grows from ambiguity. Are they going to take our water? Are they going to steal our children? Do they know how little food we have? Nobody knows. And because of that ignorance, they strike first. From about 15,000 to 9,000 years ago, signs of violence began to appear in archaeology, scattered all over the world. In Nataruk, Kenya, the bodies of men, women, and even children were found in gruesome positions. Hands bound, skulls cracked. They were slaughtered in the open, not buried, not mourned, just abandoned. In Offnet, Germany, 33 Stone Age human skulls were found in 2 pits. Some of the children's skulls were stacked together, like offerings. The skulls were smashed over and over again. Not just killed, they were crushed. These bones don't write books, but they leave behind stories. That violence is no accident. It's a subconscious rhythm, and it's contagious. The group attacked will fight back. Those who have lost will create fear in their children, and fear never dies. It just changes form. Not all archaeologists agree that it was a war, because war, by the modern definition, requires structure, strategy, leadership, ideology. But what happened thousands of years ago was something more ancient, a war that didn't know it was a war that was simply the will to survive and the impatience to wait to be attacked. Imagine a man 10,000 years ago sitting by a fire. He holds a freshly sharpened stone knife. His child is asleep on his lap. His ears pick up footsteps in the distance. Is it a deer or another human? Whatever it is, he better stand up. He better be ready. He better strike first. And just like that, war need not be declared. It just needs to be suspected. And suspicion is the beginning of all collective human tragedies. Today, we call it paranoia, but back then, it was a way of life. And from there, patterns were formed. Children were taught who was not one of us. Groups were formed with boundaries. The footprints of strangers began to be seen as threats. Over time, people began to recognize the face of the enemy, not because they were evil, but because they were different, and different was the first word born before war. When violence became a pattern, when wounds became legacies, when land began to be defended, then the seeds of what thousands of years later we would call ideology were born. War did not begin with empires. It began with unexplained loss. It began with uncontrollable fear. It began with a child killed for being on the wrong side of the river. And from there, humans began to build systems that would remind them who to attack first. In the early world, humans didn't settle down. They moved. They chased the seasons. They followed the trails of gazelles and the rivers. They slept under trees. They made roofs out of animal skins and branches, and were gone before anyone knew they were there. But then they stopped. They settled down. They planted. They saved. They shaped the land. They no longer lived off nature, but created a small version of it that they could control. And here's where everything changed. About 9,000 years ago, in what we now call Anatolia, a large settlement arose, Çatalhöyük, and a little southwest, even older, on the banks of the Jordan River, another name arose, Jericho. Both were the first villages in human history, and both built walls. The walls of Jericho were not small. They were made of stone, almost 5 meters high, with towers, with spiral staircases, with moats. Imagine it, a prehistoric society, without metal, without wheels, building a massive structure for one thing only, to keep the others out. They didn't write down their reasons, but the walls spoke louder than any writing could. We don't know who they were afraid of. Maybe a passing group of hunters, maybe another village that was growing jealous, maybe the memory of screaming nights thousands of years before, nights like Jebel Sahaba. What is clear is that they lived long enough to be afraid, and smart enough to architect their fear into stone and mud. Imagine a person from that time. He wakes up early in the morning, opens the roof of his house, because in Çatalhöyük, people go out through the roof, not the door. He sees the city walls. He knows, outside the walls, there is the possibility of death. And from childhood, he was taught, we live here. They live there. They are not allowed to come in. If they come, we fight. The village is no longer a place to live. It is a defensive structure. Every house in Çatalhöyük is stuck to one another, like bricks in flesh. There are no roads. There are no fences. Just roofs that are connected to each other. And everyone has a small spear by the fire, not for hunting, but for guarding. Why is this important? Because for the first time in history, humans build things not to live, but to defend against other humans. And once you start building a fortress, you have already admitted, I live in an unsafe world. With that, power was born. Someone had to guard the gates. Someone had to decide who was allowed in. Someone had to store the food. And from there, social classes emerged, and war slowly changed its form. Once, war was an arrow to the skull. Now, war is the distribution of grain. Who eats, who goes hungry, who is guarded by the walls, and who is outside the walls, waiting to retaliate. So the first village was not a peaceful place. The first village was a grand experiment. Could humans live together without killing each other? The answer? They tried. But they were also vigilant. And when a bad harvest came, one hungry person outside the gates, and everything that had been built could be destroyed in a single night. They had no laws, but they did have rules. And the oldest rule in human history is not morality. It is not love. It is not cooperation. It is, if it is not part of us, it is a threat. And from these first villages, the first generation of warlords was born. They were not kings, not yet, but they knew how to burn other people's houses and called it security. Villages, walls, guns, those were the first 3 pillars of civilization. And if you look around you now, the walls of your house, the fences, the CCTV, all are the legacy of that first fear. We are still building to defend against other humans, and history never stops repeating itself. If you want to know when humans first went to war, not for fear or hunger, but for strategy, territory, and power, then you must go to the forgotten desert of northeastern Syria, to a dead city called Hamoukar. Hamoukar was not the city's original name, because they didn't write, and even if they had a name, it burned with them. But the city was alive. About 3,500 years before Christ, before Egypt had pyramids, before Babylon recorded laws, before Sargon proclaimed an empire, Hamoukar was an experiment in civilization. They built walls, warehouses, craft centers. They exported goods. They stored food. And they made decisions. And their final decision was to defend the city until it was destroyed. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of Hamoukar, they did not find scattered bones, as at Jebel Sahaba or Nataruk. What they found was something more subtle and more gruesome. Layers of charcoal burning entire settlements, mud bricks melted by the intense heat, tens of thousands of stone arrowheads scattered in patterns that suggested a massive attack. They did not die one by one. They were not surprised in their sleep. They were overrun, surrounded, burned. This was not a famine, not a battle fought out of spite. This was a military campaign. And most telling, the arrowheads found came from outside Hamoukar. They were not made by them. That means the attackers came from far away. They brought their own weapons, in numbers large enough to rain down on the city for days, without negotiation, and when the arrows ran out, they burned everything. Hamoukar was no small city. It was estimated to have had thousands of people. It had a bureaucratic system, large storage facilities, and interregional trade routes. Why was it attacked? There are many theories, but one that is most often mentioned, it was because they were on an important logistics route. Their soil was fertile. They were strategically located. And they were probably too powerful to be left alone. So, who attacked them? We don't know for sure, but many archaeologists point to Uruk, a large city in southern Mesopotamia, the ancestor of Babylon. Uruk was growing rapidly. They were sending expeditions into other regions. They had more advanced technology. They had a belief system. And they believed that conquest was part of the divine mandate. What this means, war was now not just violence. It was a legitimate act, something that had to be done for the sake of expansion, for the sake of the gods, for the sake of the larger system. For the first time, war became part of the fabric of civilization. There were logistics. There were decisions. There were commands. There was a deliberate destruction, not an incident, not an emotional outburst, but an institution of violence. Imagine the people of Hamoukar in their last week. They heard the rumbling in the distance. They saw the sky darken with smoke. The children were moved inside. The old men were ordered to dig trenches. The soldiers stood on the walls, watching the arrows begin to fall like hailstones. And beneath it all, their leader probably stood tall, thinking, if we lose today, the world will never remember we existed. And he was right, because Hamoukar was never rebuilt. It was lost to history, buried in the sand, until it was rediscovered thousands of years later as the remains of the first war on a large scale. What made Hamoukar different from previous conflicts was this. It wasn't about survival. It was about conquest. It wasn't about avoiding destruction. It was about distributing that destruction to others. War was now not a response, but a strategy, and humans began to realize, if we can organize agriculture, we can organize slaughter. This was the turning point. Before this, humans feared death, but after Hamoukar, humans organized death like the logistics of trade. How many arrows would it take? How long would it take to burn a city? How many would have to be killed? for the rest to surrender. And from then on, there was no going back. Hamoukar was the epitaph of a world before strategy. After it, we no longer killed because we were afraid. We killed because we could. And if you want to know how violence was finally blessed by the heavens, then prepare for chapter 6, when the gods defended violence. Because after the first war, men were not satisfied with just victory. They wanted morality. There is one type of killing that is most sacred in history. Killing in the name of faith. And since humans have found a way to call upon God in their minds according to their beliefs, they have also found a way to seek His blessing when killing their fellow men. After Hamoukar burned, a new power arose from the plains of Mesopotamia, Uruk, the first city with writing, with a bureaucracy, with temples, and from cities like Uruk and later Akkadia, a new idea was born that had never existed before in history. The king was an extension of the gods, and to him, if the gods wanted victory, then killing was not only permitted, it was commanded. War was no longer practical. It was no longer just about territory or food. Now, war was ritual. Warriors were blessed before going into battle. Arrows were engraved with divine symbols. The king stood before his army, not as a man, but as the living representative of the gods. One early figure who personified this idea was Sargon of Akkad, who ruled around 2300 BCE. He was not only the founder of the first great empire, he was the architect of a military power based on myth. He claimed that the goddess Ishtar, goddess of war and love, guided him, that his victories were destiny. To him, anyone who opposed Sargon was opposing the gods themselves. War then ceased to be mundane. It rose in status. It became part of the cosmology. And at this point, war became legitimate, even when it tore apart cities, burned fields, and shed the blood of children. Because, they thought, if God approved of slaughter, then there was nothing wrong with destruction. In reliefs and clay tablets from Mesopotamia and Egypt, we see a recurring theme. The king stands larger than the others. His hand is raised with a spear or a sword. Beneath him, the enemy kneels, gripped by his hair. From here, the symbols of power and violence become one. Crown and sword, temple and fortress, prayer and strategy, priest and general. Even in ancient manuscripts, we begin to find texts like this. The gods have said, "Their land is yours. If they refuse, slay them, for they have rejected the will of heaven." Imagine an Akkadian warrior. He does not know why he must cross rivers, raid foreign villages, burn grain that he has never eaten. But he is told that this is a sacred duty. And they say that after all this, after he dies or kills, he will be blessed by the gods. War has changed its face. First, fear. Then, strategy. Now, faith. And from the combination of the three, the most durable system in human history was born. A state that kills with the blessing of heaven. In Egypt, the king is a god himself, he claims. The pharaoh did not just rule, he claimed to be a god. And when he conquered new territory, it was not expansion. It was a spiritual cleansing. The conquered were not victims. They were disturbances in the cosmic harmony. And the slaughter was the realignment of the world. If you ever ask yourself, how can people kill so calmly? How can violence go on for centuries and still be considered noble? Because according to their beliefs, the gods never forbid. They only choose sides. And once a man is convinced that God has chosen him, he will burn the world without guilt. But the most tragic thing is this: when war becomes sacred, the victims not only die, they are also cursed. Their deaths are divine will. Their cries have no place in poetry, and the memory of them is buried as part of the enemy. So, beneath the pillars of the first temple, behind the marble altars, is hidden the earth that once drank the blood of thousands. And history does not forget. There was a time in human history when war was not just something that happened, but something that taught. Not as a tragedy, not as a last resort, but as a matter of pride. In Mesopotamia, in the post-Sargon and Akkadian era, power was not passed down through wills or letters. It was passed down through the sword. A king was king because his father burned the city, because his grandfather had raided a neighboring village, and because his descendants would inherit the right to kill legally. Noble boys were taught 3 things. 1, to read. 2, to write. 3, to conquer. They learned strategy on clay tablets. They played role-playing as little generals. And by the age of 12, they might have stood on the city walls, watching people get punished, so they would understand. Power is not something to be questioned. An empire is not just a big building. It is an organism. And like an organism, it needs food, taxes, tribute, slaves, and war. War is the heart of an empire. It keeps territory intact. It gives reason to continue expanding borders. It keeps people afraid and leaders noble. In Babylon, in Assyria, in Hatti, in Mitanni, they all had one thing in common. War was part of the syllabus. And not just the nobility. Farmers were taught to recognize the sound of the trumpet, because at any moment, the harvest could turn into a battle parade. At any moment, the grain could become a logistic. At any moment, the house could become an outpost. Over time, violence ceased to be extraordinary. It became a social ritual. If you were a man and you never fought, you were not yet human. If you were a woman and you did not give birth to future soldiers, you had not fulfilled your duty to the world. War, like bread or water, became part of the ecosystem. And when a child was born, it was smeared with dirt, given the name of its ancestors, and promised to the land, so that when it died, it would serve as a reason for revenge. On the tablets of early civilizations, the names of kings are long and bloody: burner of 14 cities, conqueror of the east and the north, who turned the enemy's rivers red, and each successive generation was required to be bloodier than the last. In the Assyrian Empire, war even became an art. Basketballs in palaces depicted battles like dances. Enemies' heads were hung on gates, bodies were used as decoration, and school children were asked to draw battlefields so that they would understand this is how to become a strong nation. If war had previously been a tragedy, now it was an achievement, and that achievement was passed on, etched in stone, told as bedtime stories, repeated at annual festivals, and from this was born a sentence that has been repeated throughout history. We fight because our grandfathers fought. They are enemies because they killed us. This is not violence. This is revenge. This is the most dangerous form of violence, which is inherited, which is given a family name, which is considered an identity, and the new generation no longer knows why they kill. They only know they have to, because that is what their fathers did, and that is what they will pass on to their children. At this point, history loses control, because humans no longer look for reasons to fight. They just need time and their turn. And if you ask, isn't there anyone who refuses? Isn't there anyone who is tired? There will always be. But their voices are drowned out by the sound of drums, the shouts of the crowd, and the applause in the palace. Peace is never dramatic, but war always has a stage. In official history, we know the great names: Sargon, Ramses, Ashurbanipal, Hammurabi, Gilgamesh. But who remembers the name of the girl who lost her mother when Uruk invaded her village? Or the old man from a city burned by the Assyrians who managed to save only a single water jug? Who remembers them? 16. Buried beneath the great stones of civilization are the stories of ordinary people who were never warriors, never kings, never wrote victory poems. They simply lived, and because of that, they suffered longer than anyone else. Repose, the own passing. They were not the losers. They were not the winners. They were the ones left behind. The landless refugees. The children who watched their fathers die at the city gates. The woman who lived in the ruins, trying to burn wet wood to keep her child warm. 16. Repar them. After the war, the city was destroyed, but not all its inhabitants died. Returni. Some survive in the rubble. They sneak out of the trenches. They wait until the conqueror's drums have stopped. And when night falls, wrong, they return. Returni to find the bodies of their families. Shanbei. Fall strong. Repus. History records wars, but it often forgets to record what happens afterward, when cities run out of water, when the soil loses its seeds, when markets turn into fields of corpses, when schools become barracks, when folktales become silent whispers. Once, we lived here, but now it belongs to them. There are clay tablets that record the numbers of the victims, but no one records how many children lost their mother tongue, because their cities now spoke the language of the conquerors. How many songs were never sung again, because all the singers were herded away as slaves. How many silent grudges were planted, because the world gave no place for mourning. And from those ruins, a new generation was born, not of noble blood, not of kingly descent, but of loss. They were not taught to read, not taught to rule, but they were taught one thing: trust no one who carries a banner. Some of them grew up to be rebels, not because they wanted to conquer, but because they could not stand being without a place. They attacked tax convoys. They snuck into imperial villages. They stole grain, and they were called bandits, troublemakers, terrorists. But before all that, they were human. History is always written by the victors, but history is also haunted by the vanquished, those who live in the shadows, those whose names are erased, but their memories are not. Imagine a mother from a village burned by the Hattians. She lost her husband and her eldest son. She walked for 2 weeks south. She settled in the hills, clearing a small field. She didn't talk much, but every night, before going to bed, she taught her youngest son the name of their lost city, so that one day someone would remember that they existed. that they lived. They are not the main characters, but they are the souls of history, those who are not recorded, but fill the gaps between the records. And from them are born silent questions that are never answered. Why were we destroyed? What did we do wrong? Why should this land be divided in the name of a God we do not know? And that was the beginning of the next big idea, that not all destruction can be explained, that not all suffering is punishment, that the world is not fair. And when people began to realize that, they began to form something very new: religion. Not one that orders war, but one that tries to explain why the world is full of pain. For the first time, humans prayed not to win, but to understand. Lamentations were written, crying becomes song, and the temples changed, from a place of inauguration of war to a place of exploring the meaning of suffering. Priests no longer bless swords, they bless tears. And man asked the sky, "Did you hear us?" We Temple was the last safe place, a place where there are no kings, there are no soldiers, no orders, just silence, just wounds. Only humans want to live without fear. Between incense and warm stones, children say prayers without knowing to whom, but they know, outside the temple the world is not safe. And perhaps, the only place where history doesn't repeat its wounds is a place where humans do not need to win, just need to be heard. That is history, not about kings, but about those who are not mentioned, about wars we do not read about in books, about wounds inherited, not through blood, but through silence. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment. Share with those who also want to hear the voices of the past, who can no longer speak. And see you in the next silence.